This isn't a story I tell often, because revisiting it stirs up feelings I've worked hard to bury. But it's a true story, a chapter from my life that proves sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to cauterize it with fire. The grand chandeliers of l'opulenza cast a golden, forgiving light on everything, including the lie I was living. My worn-out blazer felt paper-thin under the weight of the room's opulence, a flimsy shield against the clinking of real crystal and the murmur of old money. It was my 27th birthday, and Marco Rossi, the owner, was standing over my small table for one, his smile a perfect predatory curve as he held up my credit card. "Declined," he announced, his voice carrying just enough to make the tables nearby fall silent, his eyes sweeping over me with theatrical pity before landing on the book I'd brought for company. "Perhaps," he added, a final twist of the knife, "fine dining is a bit ambitious for the bookstore clerk. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket. It wasn't just that the card was declined. I knew it would be. I had exactly $150 in my checking account, saved over 3 months of scooping quarters from my tips jar at Pages and Prose, the bookstore where I worked for $9 an hour. I'd budgeted for the tasting menu and 1 glass of wine, but I hadn't accounted for the city's outrageous hospitality tax. My plan had been to ask the waiter to just run the card for the $150, and I would pay the remaining balance in cash, all $8.42 of it. I was trying to be discreet, to handle the small embarrassment quietly, but Marco Rossi didn't do quiet. He thrived on spectacle. He was a minor celebrity in Austin's culinary scene. Marco, with his silver-streaked hair swept back from his temples and his impossibly white teeth, and his wife, Isabella, a skeletal blonde who wore her couture dresses like armor. They were l'opulenza. They were the brand, exclusive, beautiful, and cruel. Their restaurant, perched on the 2nd floor of a historic building overlooking Congress Avenue, was their kingdom. It was famous for its $1,000 Barolo and a truffle risotto that food critics wrote about in hushed, reverent tones. For a food lover like me, a culinary school dropout who channeled her passion into a small, anonymous food blog, dining there was supposed to be a pilgrimage. I had spent weeks reading reviews, studying their menu, fantasizing about the textures and flavors. It was more than a meal. It was supposed to be an affirmation that my palate, my passion, was real, even if my bank account wasn't. The evening had started out perfectly. The amuse-bouche was a delicate sphere of Parmesan foam that dissolved on the tongue into a surprising burst of aged balsamic. The first course, a seared scallop on a bed of squid ink polenta, was divine. I took notes in my little moleskin, dissecting every component, savoring the artistry. The problem started with the wine. The sommelier had recommended a vermentino with the scallop. It was a good pairing, but a little too acidic. It fought with the sweetness of the scallop instead of complementing it. When the sommelier came by, I made my fatal mistake. I tried to engage. "It's a beautiful wine," I said, trying to sound knowledgeable, not critical. But I almost wonder if a Sauvignon Blanc, maybe something from the Loire Valley, might have provided a cleaner finish against the richness of the polenta. I said it quietly, a genuine point of intellectual curiosity. The sommelier, a young man with nervous eyes, just nodded and fled. 5 minutes later, Marco appeared. He hadn't come to discuss viticulture. He had come to put the help in her place. He leaned in, his cologne a suffocating cloud of sandalwood and entitlement. "I am told you are critiquing my sommelier's choices," he began, his voice a low purr of condescension. "We base our pairings on decades of tradition, true Italian tradition, not on something you read on the internet." His eyes flicked to my off-brand handbag, then to my simple, well-loved dress. He was assessing my worth, and I was coming up short. The final verdict came when the bill arrived, and my financial reality collided with his world of effortless excess. After he announced my card's failure to the room, his wife Isabella drifted over, a wraith in silk. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm and laughed, a sound like tiny icicles shattering. "Oh, Marco, darling, don't embarrass the poor girl," she purred, which was, of course, the most embarrassing thing she could have possibly done. She looked at me, her eyes devoid of warmth. "It's sweet that you wanted to experience this, a little treat for yourself." The way she said treat made it sound like a scrap thrown to a dog. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on me, the pitying glances, the smirks, the whispers. My face was on fire. I fumbled in my purse, my hands shaking as I pulled out the crumpled $10 and $5 bills from my wallet, smoothing them on the table alongside every last quarter, dime, and nickel I had. I pushed the pile of cash and my card toward him. "Run the card for $150, I mumbled, my voice barely audible. "The rest is there." I couldn't look at him. I stared at a breadcrumb on the tablecloth as if it were the most fascinating object in the world. He didn't move. He let the silence stretch, forcing me to sit in the thick, soupy stew of my own humiliation. Finally, the waiter scurried over, a silent accomplice, and took the payment. Marco straightened his tie. "Have a pleasant evening," he said, the words dripping with insincerity. He and Isabella turned and walked away, gliding back into their world of effortless grace, leaving me in the wreckage. I didn't finish my dessert. I didn't even wait for my change. I grabbed my coat and my book and walked out, my head down, the burning stares of the other diners following me all the way to the door. I stumbled out onto the humid Austin street, the sounds of the city a jarring contrast to the morgue-like silence I'd just left. I walked for blocks without direction, the scene replaying in my mind on a torturous loop. The way he held up my card, the way she laughed, the way they made me feel like an insect. It wasn't just about the money, it was the casual, unthinking cruelty of it. They hadn't just seen my empty bank account, they had seen my dream, my passion, and they had spit on it. They had decided who was allowed to appreciate art and who wasn't, and I was on the wrong side of that line. Sitting on a bus stop bench under the garish glow of a 6th Street bar, I felt a familiar wave of despair wash over me. It was the same despair that had made me drop out of the Culinary Institute of America when my father died and his medical bills wiped out my tuition fund. It was the voice that whispered that I was destined to be on the outside looking in, cataloging other people's stories in a bookstore while my own went unwritten. But then something else surfaced. Beneath the shame, a harder, colder feeling began to crystallize. It was rage, a pure, clean, clarifying anger. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know that my palate was the one thing I had that was truly mine, honed over years of study and practice, more sensitive and educated than theirs would ever be. They saw a bookstore clerk. They had no idea they had just made an enemy of the one person who could see through their glittering facade to the rot underneath. Sitting on that bench, as the city's nightlife pulsed around me, I made a vow. It wasn't a loud, dramatic promise. It was a quiet, deadly certainty that settled deep in my bones. They thought they had humiliated me. They had no idea they had just armed me. I was going to dismantle their empire. I was going to expose their fraud. And then I was going to buy their restaurant. The bookstore became my sanctuary and my command center. The scent of old paper and brewing coffee was a balm to my frayed nerves. During my shifts, I'd shelve books on autopilot, my mind miles away, replaying every detail of that night at L'Opulenza. I wasn't just stewing in my anger. I was dissecting it, studying it like a recipe. The Rossi's cruelty was an ingredient, and I needed to understand its composition. Was it arrogance born of success, or was it a mask for some deep-seated insecurity? People who are truly confident in their craft don't need to belittle their customers. True masters are generous with their knowledge. The Rossis were gatekeepers, and that meant they were guarding, Something they didn't want people like me to see. My food blog, The Discerning Palate, had always been a passion project, a place to post recipes and muse about flavor profiles. It had a modest following, mostly other food nerds like me. I decided to weaponize it. I created a new, anonymous blog, calling it The Austin Kitchen Ledger. I used a VPN and an encrypted email address, building a digital fortress around my identity. My first post wasn't about l'opulenza. That would be too obvious. Instead, I wrote a long, detailed piece titled The 5 Lies Your Favorite Restaurant is Telling You. I wrote about the olive oil scam, how restaurants buy cheap, blended canola oil in bulk and refill the fancy, artisanal-looking bottles they leave on the tables. I wrote about fresh fish that was actually flash frozen months ago and shipped from halfway across the world. I wrote about the meaningless term farm to table, how it had been co-opted by chefs who bought their produce from the same massive distributor, Cisco, as everyone else, but would name drop a single local farm on their menu to justify a 40% markup. I described how a chef could take a cheap cut of beef, braise it for 8 hours in red wine, call it guancia di manzo al barolo, and charge $60 for what was essentially pot roast. Every word was meticulously researched but fueled by a cold fury. I posted it at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. By the end of the week, it had been shared over 5,000 times. It was all over the Austin food subreddit. Chefs, line cooks, waiters, and dishwashers were all commenting, adding their own stories of deceit and corner cutting. I had struck a nerve. The industry was talking. My next step was to find proof specific to the Rossis. My memory of the meal, once a source of humiliation, was now my most valuable asset. I went back over my notes. The scallop had been perfectly cooked, but it lacked the characteristic sweetness of a truly fresh, dry-packed scallop. It had the slightly watery, bland taste of a scallop that had been soaked in a phosphate solution, a common trick to increase weight and extend shelf life. The heirloom tomatoes in the panzanella salad were uniformly pale and mealy, a dead giveaway they were hothouse tomatoes from a massive commercial grower, not the sun-ripened jewels they claimed to be. I started digging online. I spent hours sifting through employee reviews on Glassdoor and Indeed. Most were generic complaints about long hours and low pay. But then I found a cluster of them, all from around 6 months ago, all seething with rage. One review mentioned Marco's explosive temper. Another talked about Isabella's habit of docking pay for minor infractions, like a uniform button being undone. The most interesting one was from a former dishwasher. It was short and full of typos, but it contained a golden nugget. It said, M. Rossi makes us hide the cheap boxes from Cisco before the rich people come. He says our food is from Italy, but it is from a truck like McDonald's. This was it. This was my way in. The reviewer's username was Hector G89. A little social media sleuthing, cross-referencing the username with photos tagged at Austin bars popular with service industry workers, led me to an Instagram profile for a Hector Gonzalez. His profile picture showed a young man with kind eyes and a weary smile, wearing a faded Houston Astros cap. His feed was full of pictures of his baby daughter. I crafted my message carefully. I told him I was a freelance journalist working on a story about labor conditions in the Austin restaurant scene. I said his review had resonated with me and that I believed people like him deserved to have their stories heard. I offered him $200 for an hour of his time. It was a huge chunk of my meager savings, but it was an investment. He replied within the hour. Okay. When? We met at a dive bar on the east side, the kind of place the Rossis wouldn't be caught dead in. Hector was nervous at first. He kept glancing at the door, worried that somehow Marco would find out. I bought him a beer and let him talk. He told me he'd been fired for being 5 minutes late after his daughter's daycare had a plumbing issue. Isabella had done it herself, in front of the entire kitchen staff, telling him he was unreliable and easily replaced. His story poured out, a torrent of grievances. He confirmed everything: the cheap ingredients, the frozen seafood, the lies about suppliers. But then he told me something new, something far worse. He told me about the walk-in cooler. "There's a smell, you know," he said, staring into his beer. "Like sweet but rotten. In the back, behind the shelves of fancy cheese, there's this mold. It's black, all over the wall. The health inspector, he never sees it. Before he comes, Marco makes us cover it with a big piece of stainless steel. Just lean it against the wall. He gives the inspector a free meal, a bottle of wine. The guy is in and out in 20 minutes. He also told me about the rat problem. The dumpsters in the alley behind the restaurant were always overflowing. The grease trap hadn't been properly cleaned in years. We see them sometimes, the rats, in the dish pit. We tell Marco, and he just tells us to work faster." I sat there, my recorder running on my phone, and felt a chill creep up my spine. This wasn't just about culinary snobbery anymore. This was a public health hazard. The Rossis weren't just liars, they were reckless. They were putting their customers at risk, all while charging them a fortune for the privilege. I knew I had my weapon, but I needed undeniable proof. Hector was my key. I made him a proposition. I told him I would pay him $500 for photos. Photos of the mold, photos of the overflowing dumpsters, photos of the Cisco boxes, photos of anything and everything that exposed the Rossi's lies. I saw the conflict in his eyes. He was scared, but he also had a baby to feed, and the memory of his own humiliation at Isabella's hands was still raw. "They deserve it," I said softly, pushing a $100 bill across the table as a down payment. "They treat people like they're disposable. You know that better than anyone." He stared at the money for a long moment, then slowly nodded, scooping the bill into his pocket. "I know a guy," he said, his voice low. "A prep cook. He still works there. He hates them more than I do. I'll talk to him." Leaving the bar that night, the city air felt different. It was charged with possibility. The game had changed. Before, my anger had been a diffuse, smoldering thing. Now, it had a target, a purpose. I wasn't just a scorned customer anymore. I was an investigator, a conspirator. I was building an army, one disgruntled, underpaid employee at a time. The Rossis had built their empire on a foundation of lies, and I was about to start digging. The beautiful opulent facade of l'opulenza was starting to show its cracks, and I was the one holding the hammer. The photos started coming in a few days later, sent through an encrypted messaging app from a burner phone Hector's friend, the prep cook, had bought. The first one made my stomach churn. It was a close-up of the walk-in cooler wall, a monstrous bloom of black mold, slick and furry, spread across the grout between the tiles. It looked alive. The next was a picture of a stack of boxes next to a trash can in the kitchen. The logo was unmistakable: Cisco. The box read, "Frozen scallops, product of China." The menu at l'Opulenza described them as fresh diver scallops from the Maine coast. Another photo showed a line cook relabeling dates on packages of prosciutto with a Sharpie. One by one, the images painted a damning portrait of systematic deception and dangerous negligence. I published them on the Austin Kitchen Ledger, not all at once, but slowly, methodically. I blurred out anything that could identify the kitchen or the employees. Each photo was accompanied by a detailed post explaining the industry context. I wrote about the specific health risks of Stachybotrys chartarum, the scientific name for black mold. I explained the difference in quality and price between a Chinese-farmed scallop and a wild-caught one from Maine. I became an expert in their fraud. The blog's traffic exploded. It became the talk of the town. Every chef, every foodie, every restaurant owner in Austin was reading it. The posts were debated on food forums and in the break rooms of every kitchen in the city. The anonymity was crucial. The power of the blog came from the fact that it could be any restaurant. It created a citywide atmosphere of suspicion, a cloud of doubt that hung over every high-end establishment. I knew the Rossis would be reading it too, and I hoped it was making them sweat. But I also knew that an anonymous blog and some blurry photos weren't enough to bring them down. The Rossis were masters of public relations. Their power wasn't just in their food, it was in their image. They were regulars on the society pages, photographed at charity galas and art auctions. Isabella was on the board of the Austin Symphony. Marco did guest spots on local morning shows, charming the hosts while demonstrating how to make the perfect cacio e pepe. They had built a fortress of social capital around themselves. To breach it, I needed more than just a few pictures of mold. I needed to understand their finances. This was a world I knew nothing about, but I was a fast learner. I started spending my breaks at the bookstore in the business section, devouring books on corporate finance and forensic accounting. I learned that all businesses in Texas are registered with the Secretary of State and that many of their filings were public record. I spent a weekend at the downtown library, digging through databases. I found L'Opulenza's incorporation documents, their annual reports, their liquor license applications. It was mostly boilerplate, but it gave me a framework. It also gave me the name of their landlord, a massive commercial real estate firm with a portfolio all over the city. This was where I hit my first major wall. Financial records, loan applications, lease agreements, that was all private. I couldn't get access to it. I felt my momentum stalling. The blog was causing a stir, but the Rossis were carrying on as if nothing was wrong. I saw a picture of them in a magazine, smiling at some fundraiser, and a wave of impotence washed over me. They were untouchable. They lived in a world protected by lawyers and accountants, a world I couldn't breach. The turning point came from an unexpected place. A few months prior, my grandmother had passed away, leaving me a small inheritance. It wasn't life-changing money, about $20,000, but it was the most I'd ever had. My plan had been to use it as a down payment on a tiny condo, a place of my own. It was my escape hatch from my cramped, overpriced apartment and my $9 an hour life. But as I looked at the picture of the smiling Rossis, a new, more audacious plan began to form. A house could wait. Justice couldn't. The next day, I took a day off from the bookstore and made an appointment with a private investigator. I found him online. He was a former APD detective named Frank Miller, a grizzled man with a bloodhound's face and a cheap suit. His office was a cramped, dusty room above a bail bondsman on a sketchy stretch of I-35. It smelled of stale coffee and regret. I felt ridiculous, like I was playing a character in a bad movie, but I pushed through the self-doubt. I laid out my case, carefully omitting my personal connection. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Rossis for a feature piece. I showed him the blog, the photos, the public documents I'd gathered. Frank listened patiently, his face unreadable. When I was done, he leaned back in his creaky chair and steepled his fingers. So, you've got pictures of a dirty kitchen and some cheap scallops? It's a good story for a blog, kid, but it's not a crime. Bad hygiene is a health code violation, and lying on your menu is a civil matter. What do you want from me? I think there's more, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. People who cut corners like this in one area are usually cutting them everywhere. I want to know about their finances, their debts, their suppliers. I want to know where the money is going. I pushed an envelope across the desk. It contained $5,000 in cash, a quarter of my inheritance. Frank's eyebrows shot up. He picked up the envelope, weighed it in his hand, and a flicker of interest appeared in his tired eyes. That's a healthy retainer for a freelance journalist, he said, his voice a low grumble. The Austin American-Statesman doesn't even pay that well. I have a feeling the story will be worth it, I replied. He grunted, a sound that seemed to be his version of a smile. Okay, kid, I'll do some digging. Don't call me, I'll call you. For the next 2 weeks, I was on edge. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. I kept the blog going, posting more general articles about the restaurant industry to keep the conversation alive without tipping my hand. I felt like I was living a double life. By day, I was Maya, the quiet bookstore clerk, recommending historical fiction and making lattes. By night, I was the ledger, a phantom haunting the Austin food scene, meticulously planning the downfall of its king and queen. The call from Frank came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was shelving a new shipment of biographies. He was blunt. "Meet me at the office, 1 hour." I practically ran out of the bookstore, telling my manager I had a family emergency. When I got to Frank's office, he had a thin manila folder on his desk. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Your instincts were good, kid," he said, pushing the folder toward me. "The Rossis are drowning." I opened the folder. Inside were copies of credit reports, bank statements, and legal notices. It was a mess. They were leveraged to the hilt with multiple high-interest business loans. They had missed payroll twice in the last 6 months, a fact Frank had learned from a disgruntled former accountant. They were 3 months behind on their lease payments to the commercial real estate firm. But the real bombshell was Marco's personal finances. He had a line of credit from a casino in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and he was making weekly wire transfers to an offshore sports betting website. He had a massive gambling problem. "He's bleeding the restaurant dry," Frank explained, using business accounts to cover his losses. That, right there, is embezzlement and wire fraud. It's no longer a civil matter. It's a felony. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. The arrogance, the cruelty, the desperate need to project an image of success. It all made sense now. They weren't just gatekeepers. They were terrified imposters, running a Ponzi scheme of a restaurant, using new loans to pay off old debts, all while Marco threw money away at the poker table. But Frank wasn't done. He had saved the best for last. "There's one more thing," he said, a glint in his eye. "They're trying to get out. They've applied for a huge expansion loan from Austin Capital Bank, $10 million. They want to franchise L'Opulenza, open up new locations in Dallas and Houston. It's their last-ditch effort to get a massive infusion of cash to cover up the hole they're in." He let that sink in. "The loan is in the final stages of approval. It's all contingent on 2 things, a stellar public image and passing their upcoming annual health inspection with flying colors. The inspection is scheduled for next Tuesday." A slow smile spread across my face. It felt cold, foreign. The untouchable fortress wasn't a fortress at all. It was a house of cards, and I had just been handed a hurricane. Frank watched me, a flicker of something, respect, amusement, in his eyes. "So, journalist," he said, leaning back, "what are you going to do with this story?" I looked down at the evidence in my hands, the photos of the mold, the proof of financial fraud, the timeline of their desperation. My path was suddenly, blindingly clear. This wasn't going to be a story. It was going to be a symphony of destruction, and I was the conductor. The week leading up to the health inspection was the longest of my life. I operated with a kind of hyper-focused clarity I'd never experienced before. My grief, my anger, my shame, all of it had been forged into a single sharp instrument. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My apartment was covered in notes, timelines, and contact lists. It was my war room. I had 2 primary fronts for my attack: public humiliation and regulatory annihilation. They had to happen simultaneously for maximum impact. First, the public front. A story this big couldn't just be dumped on my anonymous blog. It needed the credibility of a major news outlet. I spent a day researching journalists at the Austin American-Statesman, looking for someone with a reputation for tenacity and a history of taking on powerful people. I found Sarah Jenkins, an investigative reporter who had recently broken a story about a corrupt city council member. I created a new, secure email account and sent her a message. I kept it brief and tantalizing. "I have documented proof of felony-level financial fraud, rampant health code violations, and consumer deception at one of Austin's most celebrated restaurants. This is a story that will rock the city's culinary scene. Are you interested? I attached a single, heavily redacted bank statement showing a large transfer from the La Palenza business account to the offshore betting site. She replied in less than 10 minutes. I'm interested. How do we talk? We arranged a meeting. We met on a park bench in Zilker Park, like something out of a spy movie. I insisted she leave her phone in her car. I showed her everything, Frank's entire file, the unredacted bank statements, the photos from the kitchen, and sworn, notarized affidavits from Hector and the prep cook, whose name was Carlos. I had paid them both well for their cooperation, using more of my inheritance. Sarah's eyes widened as she went through the file. She was a pro. She understood the gravity of it immediately. She knew this was more than just a restaurant review. It was a front-page story. I gave her everything on a USB drive. There's only one condition, I told her. You can't publish it until I give you the signal. The story has to go live at exactly 11:30 a.m. next Tuesday. She agreed, a hungry, determined look on her face. Phase 1 was set. Phase 2 was the health inspection itself. Just getting the restaurant shut down wasn't enough. I wanted it to be spectacular. I wanted it to be undeniable. I knew from Hector that the Rossis did a frantic, superficial cleaning the day before the inspection, and that they had their tricks, like hiding the mold behind the steel plate. An ordinary inspection might miss things. I needed to make sure the inspector knew exactly where to look. On Monday, the day before the inspection, I drove to a 24-hour print shop in a different part of town and typed up an anonymous letter. I didn't use a computer. I used one of their public typewriters, an ancient IBM Selectric, to avoid any kind of digital trail. The letter was addressed to the lead inspector for the downtown district at the Austin Public Health Department. I wrote it from the perspective of a terrified, guilt-ridden employee. I cannot stay silent any longer, it began. The conditions at L'Opulenza are a danger to the public. I then provided a precise, detailed list of violations, complete with directions. Check the wall behind the freestanding steel shelf in the rear of the walk-in cooler for extensive black mold. Check the grease trap in the alley. It has not been professionally serviced in over a year. Ask to see the invoices for their main diver scallops and compare them to the boxes of frozen Chinese scallops hidden in the basement storage freezer. Check the expiration dates on the cured meats and then ask to see the box of Sharpies they used to alter them. The list went on for 2 pages. It was a guided tour of their filth and fraud. I mailed it from a post office box clear across the city, timing it so it would arrive on Tuesday morning, just before the inspector headed out for his rounds. The night before the final act, I couldn't sit still. I walked the streets of downtown Austin, eventually finding myself across from L'Opulenza. The lights were on. Through the grand windows, I could see the staff moving, the diners laughing, blissfully unaware of the rot behind the curtain. I could see Marco gliding through the room, exuding charm. I saw Isabella adjust a flower arrangement on a table, her expression one of bored perfection. They looked so confident, so secure in their little kingdom of lies. A year ago, I would have looked at that scene with longing and envy. Now, all I felt was a profound, chilling sense of calm. I was a god of vengeance, watching my oblivious targets enjoy their last supper. Tuesday morning, I was at my post by 9 a.m. My post was a small coffee shop, directly across the street from the restaurant, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the front entrance. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a window table, my laptop open, my phone on the table beside it. I had 2 browser tabs open, the website for the Austin American-Statesman and the city's public health inspection database. I nursed my coffee for 2 hours, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. At 11:05 a.m., a navy blue Ford sedan with the City of Austin logo on the side pulled up. A man in a polo shirt with a clipboard got out. The health inspector. I watched him walk to the front door and go inside. The countdown had begun. I imagined the scene inside. The forced smiles from Marco, the feigned surprise, the inspector armed with my anonymous tip being unusually thorough. I pictured him walking into the kitchen, his eyes missing nothing. I imagined him asking to see the walk-in, telling them to move the steel plate. The panic that must have bloomed in Marco's chest at that moment was a thing I savored. At 11:28 a.m., I sent a one-word text to Sarah Jenkins. Now. At exactly 11:30 a.m., I refreshed the Statesman's homepage. The banner headline, in huge, bold letters, appeared, Austin's elite eatery, L'Opulenza, accused of fraud, embezzlement, and dangerous health violations. Sarah's story was a masterpiece of journalistic destruction. It had everything: the financial documents, the interviews with former employees, the photos, the details about Marco's gambling debts. It was a surgical demolition of their reputation. My phone started vibrating almost immediately, alerts from news apps as other outlets picked up the story. But I kept my eyes on the front door of the restaurant. A few minutes later, the inspector walked out. He wasn't alone. Marco was with him, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The inspector took a large, bright red piece of paper and slapped it onto the glass of the front door. He pressed it firmly, ensuring it would stick. From across the street, I could read the words, "Closed by order of the Austin Public Health Department." That was when the real show began. Marco's phone must have started exploding with notifications about the article. I saw him pull it out of his pocket, his face going from red to a sickly, pale white as he read. He started yelling at the inspector, gesturing wildly. Then Isabella burst out of the door, her perfect composure finally shattered, her face a mess of tears and fury. The loan from Austin Capital Bank was gone. Their franchise dreams were gone. Their reputation was incinerated. They were ruined, and it was all happening in real time, on a Tuesday morning, on a public street. I watched them for a few more minutes, a strange detachment settling over me. The rage that had fueled me for months had burned away, leaving behind a cold, clean emptiness. I took a final sip of my now cold coffee, closed my laptop, and left a $10 bill on the table. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The kingdom had fallen. In the chaotic weeks that followed, the Rossi's world completely unraveled. The Statesman's story was just the beginning. The local news channels picked it up, running segments with concerned-looking anchors standing in front of the red-tagged door of L'Opulenza. Food bloggers and influencers who had once sung their praises either fell silent or issued public statements of shock and disappointment. Their powerful friends on the charity circuit vanished, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Austin Capital Bank not only rescinded the $10 million loan offer, but also called in their existing loans, citing clauses in their agreements related to fraudulent activity and reputational damage. The commercial real estate firm that owned the building immediately began eviction proceedings for non-payment of rent. On top of everything, the Travis County District Attorney's Office announced they were opening a criminal investigation into Marco Rossi for embezzlement. They were in a death spiral, and there was nothing they could do to pull out of it. They were forced to declare bankruptcy, both personally and for their business. Everything had to be liquidated. Their custom-built home in Westlake Hills, Isabella's collection of designer handbags, the restaurant's wine cellar, the kitchen equipment, the custom-made furniture. It was all put up for auction, a fire sale of the remnants of their shattered lives. I followed the proceedings through the public notices, a silent, invisible observer. I never gloated. I didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. During this time, I made some changes of my own. I quit my job at the bookstore. My manager was sad to see me go, but I told her I was pursuing a new opportunity. I took the remaining $15,000 of my inheritance and enrolled in an intensive business management course at the local community college. I spent my days learning about profit and loss statements, supply chain management, and marketing. I spent my nights drafting a business plan. It was a detailed 30-page document, complete with a proposed menu, a staffing plan, and a 5-year financial projection. When the notice for the L'Opulenza asset auction was posted, I was ready. The auction was for the restaurant's fixtures and lease assumption. Essentially, the winning bidder would get all the kitchen equipment, the tables, the chairs, and, most importantly, the right to take over the highly desirable downtown lease. Because of the public scandal and the bankruptcy, the starting bid was insultingly low. The big restaurant groups were staying away, not wanting to touch such a toxic property. The only interested parties were bottom feeders, people looking to get a cheap kitchen to flip. I registered as a bidder under a newly formed LLC, Palette and Principal Hospitality Group. The name was a private joke, just for me. I walked into the auction, held in a sterile downtown conference room, and saw a handful of other bidders, mostly middle-aged men in cheap suits who looked like they owned a string of struggling sports bars. They didn't even glance at me. I was just some young woman in a blazer, probably someone's assistant. I let them do the initial bidding, driving the price up in small increments. When the bidding stalled and the auctioneer was about to bring the hammer down, I raised my paddle. I made one bid. It was for a number that I had calculated to the dollar. It was the absolute maximum I could afford with my inheritance and the small business loan I had managed to secure, using my meticulous business plan to convince a loan officer at a small credit union. My bid was significantly higher than the previous one, designed to be a knockout punch. The room went silent. The other bidders looked at me, first in confusion, then in annoyance. They weren't willing to go that high. The auctioneer called my number. Going once, going twice, sold. He banged the gavel. Just like that, it was mine. The lease, the stoves, the tables, the walk-in cooler with the now scrubbed clean walls, all of it. The 6 months that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. I didn't just renovate the restaurant, I performed an exorcism. We gutted the place. We tore out the ostentatious chandeliers and the gaudy velvet curtains. We ripped up the carpet and polished the original concrete floors underneath. I wanted no trace of the Rossis, no ghost of their arrogance to remain. My contractor thought I was crazy, but I insisted on replumbing the entire kitchen and installing a brand new ventilation system. I wanted it to be clean, not just on the surface, but in its bones. Hector and Carlos, the dishwasher and prep cook, who had been my secret weapons, were my first two hires. Hector became my purchasing manager, his honesty and work ethic a perfect fit for building relationships with real local farmers. Carlos, whose knife skills were exceptional, became my sous chef. We built a new team, a small, dedicated crew who believed in what we were doing. We weren't just building a restaurant, we were building a culture of respect. We reopened on a cool evening in early spring. I renamed the place Acre, a simple name that reflected our commitment to the land and the source of our ingredients. The decor was minimalist and warm, with reclaimed wood tables, soft lighting, and a single, stunning mural of the Texas Hill Country painted by a local artist. The menu was small, seasonal, and honest. We made everything in-house, from the bread to the pasta to the ice cream. There was no fake Italian tradition, no deceptive language. If the scallops came from Massachusetts, the menu said so. If the tomatoes were from a farm in Driftwood, we named the farm. The opening night was terrifying and exhilarating. The place was packed. Sarah Jenkins, the reporter, was there at a corner table, and she gave me a small, discreet nod of approval. The Austin food world, intrigued by the story of L'Opulenza's dramatic collapse and the mystery of its new owner, had turned out in force. I didn't stay in the back. I worked the floor, just as Marco had. But instead of intimidating my guests, I talked to them. I explained the dishes, I shared stories about the farmers we worked with, I poured wine and cleared plates. I wanted them to feel welcome, not judged. Late in the evening, as the dinner rush was winding down, I was standing near the host stand when the front door opened. For a split second, my blood ran cold. It was Marco and Isabella Rossi. They looked diminished. Marco had lost weight, and his expensive suit hung on him. Isabella's face was drawn and tight, the mask of bored superiority replaced by a permanent scowl. They weren't there to dine. They were just standing in the doorway, staring into the restaurant that had once been theirs. They were looking at the bustling, happy room, at the staff who were laughing in the open kitchen, at me. Marco's eyes met mine across the room. There was no recognition, just a blank, hollowed-out resentment. He was looking at a stranger who had taken his kingdom. He couldn't possibly know that the woman standing before him, the owner of this successful new venture, was the same bookstore clerk he had humiliated for being unable to afford a meal. I held his gaze, my expression calm, neutral. I didn't smile. I didn't sneer. I just looked at him, letting him see me, letting him see what had grown from the ashes of his ruin. After a long, silent moment, Isabella tugged on his arm, and they turned and disappeared into the night. I never saw them again. I heard they moved to Florida to live with her parents. Their story became a cautionary tale, whispered in the kitchens and bars of Austin, a ghost of hubris and failure. My story, however, was just beginning. Acre became a success, earning rave reviews not just for its food, but for its ethics. It became known as a place where good food and good people thrived. I stood for a moment longer, looking at the door they had just walked out of. I ran a hand over the smooth, cool wood of the host stand, the heart of my restaurant, my sanctuary, my victory. He told me people who work for minimum wage shouldn't understand luxury. He never considered that one day I might be the one defining it. The end.